Cyber threats target digital identities. Do you know who or what is accessing your company's apps, systems, and data? You need to know who's there, who to let in, and who to keep out. And you'll need more than access management to stay secure. You need SailPoint Identity Security. As the leader in identity security, SailPoint can help mature your security resilience while driving efficiencies and compliance for your organization. Start your identity journey with SailPoint's free maturity assessment. Go to securityweekly.com/SailPoint to get your free identity security assessment today. Are you constantly thinking about how to keep your enterprise as secure as possible? Get to know Chrome Enterprise, the trusted browser for security-conscious professionals like you. Its ease of use for IT and security teams and added access controls protect the remote, extended, and hybrid workforce, keeping your entire enterprise safe. Don't settle for a browser that compromises your organization. Visit securityweekly.com/Chrome Enterprise now to learn more and start protecting your enterprise like never before. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Security Weekly listeners, InfoSec World 2023 is just weeks away. Have you registered to join over 2,500 cybersecurity experts on September 25th through 27th in Lake Buena Vista, Florida? InfoSec World is your gateway to a world of knowledge and growth. Don't miss the chance to enhance your career, connect with industry leaders, and make an impact on the rapidly evolving landscape. Secure your seat using code ISW23-SecWeek20 to save 20% off your registration. Register today at securityweekly.com/InfoSecWorld2023. And that is next week. That is really close. So if you're in the area, it's a great conference to go check out. There's going to be a lot of good talks, and hope there's a good turnout. Also, I think we're going to have some interviews coming from there that we will air on this show in the weeks to come. All right, for this interview, Ryan Freed from Mandiant joins us once again today to talk about tabletop exercises. Ryan has made several appearances on the show, initially as a practitioner at Brooks and most recently in his new role at Mandiant. Welcome to the show, Ryan.
Thanks, happy to be back.
Yeah, and one of my favorite topics here, and for Ryan, he's going to be hearing me say this for the second time, but the reason this is one of my favorite topics is I do a lot of analysis on what goes wrong in cybersecurity, why breaches happen, why there are failures, and a lot of it seems to come down to people and process. In a lot of cases, you see people had exactly what they needed to prevent, a bad outcome. They had the people they needed, but those people didn't know what they were doing with those tools, or the tools weren't correctly configured, or they weren't fully implemented. There's always just these little pieces missing. Maybe they're aware of it. They never finished a project. In some cases, they thought they finished a project. I recall one case in particular where an EDR tool was rolled out to thousands, I think 8,000 endpoints, but nobody pushed a policy to it. They didn't realize they had missed a step there. So they literally just had to push one more button and they would have been done. So how do you discover that kind of stuff? How do you realize when you're missing some of this critical process stuff? So Ryan, this is why I get so excited about this topic, and I'm glad we're talking about tabletops today.
Yeah, I'm sure many of us have a story, specifically within the last 3 months, we went through an incident and we found out our VPN logs weren't being sent to our SIM because some password was changed or it was moved to a different syslog broker, and we just didn't have them. And that's something that, if we were practicing more often in different scenarios, we would have found out earlier on. So yeah, I feel your story is like that.
Yeah, I have a much older story, but they were doing battery maintenance in the data center, which required all the racks to lose power, everything to be cleanly powered off. And most of the systems in the racks would automatically switch back on and boot up just when you restored power to them. But some of them required someone to go push a button with a finger. And our SIM was one of those products. Oh. And 3 weeks later, when we had an incident, we found out our SIMs were still off from that battery maintenance in the data center. and we realized we needed some kind of uptime monitor, some kind of quality monitoring on our SIM.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like, I used to purchase products on the practitioner side. Almost always they'll ask why you're looking at this product, and it seems like it's either compliance or a recent incident, because you don't want to have the same situation twice, and you want to fill in those gaps. So, as a vendor, that's the right time to engage with other people because it's fresh in their mind. And like I said, you don't want to go through that twice if you can avoid it.
Tabletops are kind of like pen tests, right? Like when you say that word, uh, there's either very specific things that enter people's minds because they're picturing what they've experienced personally, or they have a lot more experience and they realize like there are really, really bad ones and there's really, really good ones, and there's a lot of space in between. So what are we talking about when we say tabletops here? Maybe give us a bit of a um, some idea of the different kinds of tabletops and the breadth of the types of tabletops that you're doing.
Yeah, I think it's really a journey. Initially starting off, it's important to separate a technical tabletop exercise from an executive tabletop. Very different objectives, very different audience. So for a technical tabletop, you might have a scenario, maybe you have an externally facing server, it's compromised, has a connection into your network, ransomware happens, what do you do? Who needs to know what and when? And what are your technical controls to isolate? If you have to rely on the network team to isolate, do you have an on-call person if it's after hours? All those really low-level details from a technical perspective. So by the end, you hopefully want to feel good about having really good documented procedures for those types of situations. And ransomware is one example. There are many others, but that's typically what we see. And then from an executive tabletop, taking that really tactical information and communicating that from most likely the incident commander, figuring out really the first question is who can declare an incident and who becomes the commander. And then for the executives, like I said, who needs to know what, how often, do they have to report to the board? If this affects customers, making sure information doesn't leak, who's responsible for contacting or interfacing with the media, shareholders, all those kind of situations. So that's usually the first level. And then, we talked about previously, you might actually run a scenario. You kind of combine it with a red team assessment where you actually have ransomware in a sandbox or isolated part of your environment and, proving those controls of isolating it, wiping it, collecting forensic images, those kind of stuff.
So, how many assumptions do you have to make here versus you're actually trying to do some real things here? Like one of the surprises that I've heard, certainly I think the number one surprise I've heard, people coming out of incidents, especially ransomware incidents, is not knowing who to talk to for different things. Like who decides if we pay the ransom or not, and who can tell me whether or not I can shut off this machine or not, tends to be a big one. But then there's other ones I've heard where third parties come into play where, okay, if we're planning on using filing an insurance claim with our cybersecurity policy on this, all of a sudden the decision of whether to pay or not is no longer in our hands. Like the insurance company now gets to make that choice. Are you discovering those kinds of things in these tabletops, or do you have to make some assumptions? Like maybe you don't even know if they have cybersecurity insurance when you're coming in and doing this.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we try to get that information up front, but there are a lot of assumptions that we try to uncover. So, for instance, a lot of companies have a retainer with us for incident response, and we'll help contain ransomware, try to kick the threat actor out of the environment. But we're not going to do ransomware negotiation. We're not going to talk to the threat actor, and we're not going to try decryption. And the customer needs to know that up front. We also see a lot of the time the interface with outside counsel and how that's done, because typically legal or outside counsel might actually engage with the insurance company or the retainer so you can maintain that attorney-client privilege. So there is a lot of complexity when you start to think about insurance, outside counsel, all your different partners. Maybe you work with an MSSP for your EDR or different things. So we try to,
Right.
look at all those complexities and understand who's authorized to contact. And I'd argue just as important, what's the severity level that you're engaging your IR retainer? Is it a medium or critical or high? What defines high or critical? Whether it's a certain amount of systems or customer facing. It's really helpful to have that stuff defined so there's no question, when to engage these different third parties.
Right. Like one of the horror stories I've heard is, oh, we were having an incident and we called our MSSP and asked for the data for this system for the previous 24 hours, and the response was, oh, you don't pay for that level of service. We can't give that data to you. Which to me, like,
Hello. So actually, I was thinking about a different scenario I've run into where there is a defined emergency operations center, but their focus isn't on IT. It's on the facility and the business. And, IT needs to have a seat at the table when they're doing their tabletops. And even discovering that the IT folks weren't on the allowed folks to get back in before the general populace was allowed in, which seems like a dumb moment, but that's a communication breakdown. Have you run into things like that, or am I very unique there?
No, I can see what you mean. Sometimes we'll see the crisis management team. Cybersecurity is just one part of it. There will
Right.
be physical security type incidents, operational type, and I think people sometimes forget about that cybersecurity is just one reason. I mean, think about COVID and the pandemic. That was another emergency response and crisis communication type situation that companies had to deal with. So the process should be really similar. It's just different situations that you run into.
and so
Did we? I was going to say, any advice for our average CISO to make sure they don't wind up without a seat at the table?
Yeah, I mean, having those communications early, I think starting with like your chief legal officer is usually a good place if, since legal is typically involved, maybe your COO. But yeah, engaging, if you have a chief risk officer, it's funny because I feel like there should be more tabletop exercises outside of cyber, but in my experience, whether it's part of compliance or just because of the threat landscape out there right now, I find a lot of the time that cybersecurity or the CISO are running these types of exercises. So then when you get that crisis management team in their heads, they're thinking, well, maybe this would be a good idea to plan for other types of situations, like operational outages.
Mm-hmm. Well,
disaster recovery, right?
Yeah.
BCP, yeah. Yeah, so it sounded like you gave out some examples of as we've been talking about this, you've been throwing out examples of mostly the executive side of the tabletops, right? Like we've been talking about crisis communications and getting in touch with legal, whereas I imagine the technical tabletops, the discussion is more around, will you be able to can you detect these lateral movement efforts? Are you prepared to, detect all these TTPs that are typical of an attacker coming in and installing malware? Now, on the technical side, are those usually pretty scenario specific, and are they all ransomware these days?
A lot of them are. Yeah. I mean, you start with one situation and then the injects, when you give more information that changes the scenario, um, we'll move this scenario along. But yeah, we might see, a data breach. Sometimes we'll see a third party software that's compromised. So think about like SolarWinds or similar ones to that. So having the capability to remove software, But I think one really important thing that comes up in the technical exercises are, is the SOC team and who on the SOC team is authorized to isolate a system? I've seen
Yeah.
from both ends of the spectrum where teams have in writing, which I think is really important from the CTO or the C-suite, that the security team has authorization in the, in a crisis to contain a system, which might have critical business processes associated with it or domain controllers. But, once again, time is of the essence. I've seen other teams where they have the ability to isolate workstations and maybe low critical systems, assuming you have your systems labeled, but they actually have to get permission to isolate, medium or high, or basically any systems with business critical processes. And that's really important to know beforehand, because you don't want to be making these decisions without being informed about that.
Work goes into preparing for the tabletop, making sure that you have the right people in the room for that tabletop. Is there a lot of effort spent trying to figure out who those people are and making sure that they're going to be available when you do it?
Yeah, that is really important. If you don't have the right people at the table who are prepared, it's not going to be a very successful exercise. I think, a really interesting part of the technical ones is security, is the main focus, but inviting like service desk, your infrastructure team, your cloud team, it helps inform, why you're doing these or asking for these certain types of controls. Or most likely, if we need some forensics from the cloud or different endpoints, we might have to work with other teams and we want them to be ready, or, VMware virtualized environments. So it's important to bring those people who are actually doing the work. Having a manager is helpful, but having, a couple people, representatives from those different teams, I think is really important.
Do you find that people have really now understand the what BCDR really means, and it's not just go get the tapes and start doing restores? And are they keeping their plans up to date?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. It's interesting to see how BCDR, in my experience, typically falls under security, which it's a risk, and availability is part of the CIA triad, but it's not something I would necessarily automatically correlate with security. But I'm starting to see more and more of, so coming back to tabletop exercises, it's one thing to talk through, this system went down or we have to fail over to our DR environment, but it's really critical to actually do it. Like it doesn't need to be a business critical system, but actually failing over to your DR environment in that island so there's not, IP address conflicts, taking that tape, actually restoring it, and then working with the business to get to the data that they need. So I'm starting to see that done more often as part of, ransomware preparedness, but really just best practice for disaster recovery, of going through the motions and recovering it to the point where the business process is available and the data is available.
Yeah. Yeah, I know from experience, if you don't know how to do that, it's really hard when the chips are down. But you made me think of it. I was in a DR session at a conference a number of years ago, and a young lady stood up in the back and said, "So when do I get to start kicking cables out of the wall?" How's that for frightening? Well intended.
Yeah, I remember. Yep, I remember a story I think I read about within the last couple of years. I think Netflix has a team where they literally just get to start pulling cables and
Yeah.
ensuring they have the redundancy. So that's a whole
Chaos
next
engineering.
level.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. They design software just to, that randomizes, simulates random bad things happening to their infrastructure, just so they can make sure they can survive random bad things. Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of terrifying, right?
Oh,
yep. Yeah, so if I can just add a couple other things, because I've been part of really bad tabletop exercises. I've planned them internally and now, providing them as a service for clients. I think a really big wealth of information is finding people who have been in IT for the last, 5 or 10 years at a company, because they've been part of incidents that maybe other people aren't as familiar with. And those incidents were handled a certain way. Maybe they were handled great, maybe not so much, but they're realistic because they actually happen. So I really love developing injects and situations based off of past incidents, just picking their brain for an hour of the kind of things that the war stories that they have. So I think that's usually super helpful, because there's no worse tabletop than, having an external person plan it and saying your internal Jira server was compromised, and then the client saying we use Jira Cloud, and you want them to play along with it, but you lose a lot of credibility
Right.
that way. So there has to be a lot of work making sure it's truly believable.
It needs to feel authentic to them for them to take it seriously, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, and then even with Mandiant, we try to partner our threat intelligence, and we'll look at different threat actors that have targeted your industry in your country in the last 3 months, and we'll try to use those tactics and techniques of those threat actors and what they're targeting and incorporate that. So that's, maybe it hasn't happened to your company yet, but it's happened to companies, in your country, in your vertical. So that provides even more realistic scenarios. And then one other piece, just because I've gone through this before, you really need to make sure someone's taking notes. It's great to record things, but I've gone through 2-hour exercises where no one was taking notes and we didn't record it.
Oh no.
So we had all these great lessons learned, but nobody wrote it down. So we were all jogging our memory, and we maybe captured half of what we talked about doing, but super important to have a note taker, so you can actually have deliverables out of that.
Mhm.
Oh, that's literally setting fire to cash right there. Come on,
Yeah.
guys. Take some notes. Somebody pull out a notebook.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're paying for a pro from Dover to sit there and walk you through it. Jiminy Christmas, you want to record what's going on, don't you?
Right. Right.
Definitely. We did that one internally, and that's just not something we thought to do. So lesson learned.
Yeah. So what are some of the things back when you pre-Mandiant, before you started doing this as a professional service? Are there things like, obviously having access to that threat intel that's hugely valuable to make the tabletop more relevant and realistic? But are there like head slapping type stuff, like that you've learned going to Mandiant, doing tabletops there, that you wish you had known when you were just doing them yourselves and Googling how to do a tabletop? Or yeah, I don't know how most of us did tabletops back in the day, except ask other people and search online, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, pre-Mandiant, I would search the web. There's some pretty good resources out there. I think I forgot what government agency is. Maybe it's DHS or one of the other ones, but they actually provide some pretty good tabletop exercises. And there's a couple that are cyber specific. That'll last you for a couple of years, but I typically just take the articles that I'm reading, and it's less important of what the specific scenario is, but it's the muscle memory of, capturing forensics, having the right logs, maybe for a SaaS application, and those. So you can put hours and hours and hours into injects, and it's nice at Mandiant because we'll have a library of them, and we can do similar injects across different verticals. So that makes it a little bit easier there. But like you said, getting the right people is super important. And that's a little bit easier when you're within the company because you have that knowledge. But yeah, I think having templates here at Mandiant is definitely helpful. Otherwise, you're just doing it on your own, and you don't have a formal report if you're doing it internally. But it's still nice to have some kind of deliverable at the end.
Yeah. So I've mentioned in the past, sometimes thinking about security operations, particularly incident response, is like playing with a sports team, where if you do your incident response test once a year, like PCI DSS requires, you're probably not going to be any good when you get out on the field or on the court. But you mentioned muscle memory. And if I've got you coming in doing tabletops maybe once a year, twice a year, I'm probably not going to get the muscle memory from that. So what's the lesson learned there? What's the general takeaway for them to get that muscle memory with DFIR tools and things like that? What's there's some kind of prescribed practice that comes out of doing the tabletops that, oh, we need to use a breach and attack simulation tool, or like how are people getting that muscle memory?
Yeah, I'd offered two suggestions that I've done in the past at past companies. One, if you have a security staff meeting, a SOC meeting every week, use one of those maybe once a month. Get a scenario that you read about in the news and just talk through what you would do. How would you contain it? What logs would you need? Who would need to know what? So you can just read different scenarios and talk through them. But the other one, which I think is just as impactful, is set a reminder or set up a meeting every 3 or 6 months and literally capture forensics for a machine. So you can do something for like a workstation, a server, and then something in the cloud, because tools change, processes change. So it's, super easy. It's really good for new people to the team because it increases their ability to do it. And it makes your documentation way better too, because you're updating every 3 months. So yeah, it's just setting, a recurring meeting. I think forensics is typically, one of the things that I'd recommend practicing, and just trying something different each time. Because in my experience, we had to rely on the server team to pull RAM from VMs in VMware, and they didn't have a procedure to do it, and we were kind of scrambling during an incident. But if that's something we practice every 3 or 6 months, they would have documented procedures and it'd be pretty easy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was thinking that not just, and on the IT staff side, that they not only just know how to bring back the OS, but actually up the application stack. Don't just bring back the server for the financials, run a payroll, run a business process. That makes it more generic, right? And that's a lot harder. It has more dependencies.
Yeah, it's really involved. It takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of their time. It's really important, but as you do the business recovery procedures, or from a DR perspective, having like written instructions, hopefully printed out, of step by step of how you recover is important, not just to the OS level, like you're saying, but having detailed instructions to the application level and doing that for your critical applications. You don't have to figure it out on the fly.
Do you find there's any challenges getting sufficient management support for the activities? Not just, can I attend a meeting, but can I pay for some infrastructure to practice on, kind of things?
In my experience, no. Uptime has been really important for the companies I've been at. So I haven't seen a ton of pushback, from a BCDR or a cybersecurity like tabletop exercise. Mm-hmm. But a lot of that has come through audits. Like, it's not something they just thought about. It's not something they thought about one day, right? Compliance can be your friend. It's not something they just thought about. They were dinged on something, and all of a sudden now you can start engaging with vendors to help augment your BCDR or tabletop. So it's not something you might get right away, but now more than ever, I feel like from a tabletop perspective, the C-suite is as nervous about it, and they don't want to be unprepared if something happens.
Oh, I know that. Oh crap, we got a finding in an audit. I don't want that again. The other thing I was thinking about is to get real BCDR plans, as opposed to service recovery at the business level. That you not only need people that looking at not IT but business people, but also lead from the very top. Somebody has to say, this is a priority for our company. We will do it. Do people, I think what you asked earlier, people understand the difference, right? Between recovery IT and recover the business?
I think so. I mean, sometimes it takes, education, but yeah, I mean, disaster recovery from the technical side, having the recovery time objective of how long it takes to take a technical system, stand it back up. Maybe you have a backup system, a backup collaboration tool, backup, email, chat, um, or other business critical systems. But then business continuity is, can they actually do the process on that application?
Mm-hmm.
So taking it, one step further.
And I've noticed the business leadership has a completely different view on what's required to get their business done than cyber or IT does.
Yeah, one of the most fun, I've been involved with BCDR and previous companies is when you ask the business what their recovery time objective is, or recovery point objective of how much data they can live without. And in my experience, the RTO of having the system back online is usually very fast, an hour, 2 hours, 4 hours. And then what I don't see in all companies is IT pushing back. Sometimes they just agree to it, but then, when the incident happens and all of a sudden they can't recover it in 4 hours, the business is pissed. You have this disconnect between the two. What you can do if you're, the tech side is like, great, you want 2 hours? Give me a, active data center that costs millions of dollars. And they're like, okay, 1 day is fine. Everyone's application is critical.
Yeah, and the language you push back with is the language of money, right? Like, okay, well, you want 1 hour? Here's what 1 hour costs.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't know where I lost you. I think I was in the middle of answering a question. I don't know how much you got, but our own podcast tabletops have served us well, and I've lost both power and internet twice so far during this episode. And I think the first one nobody noticed. I switched over to my phone. There was a big storm here where I'm at in Florida, but I am back to landline now, and the house internet versus my phone internet. And I was asking a question about how you know when somebody's ready for a tabletop, or maybe they're a bit too advanced for a tabletop, or does that even happen? Do you ever get so prepared that you don't really need the tabletops anymore, or do you always use them in conjunction with, maybe red teaming and stuff like that? But I kind of want to address both sides. Like, can you be so inexperienced that you're not ready for a tabletop yet? Let's start there.
I don't think so. I mean, as long as you're comfortable being uncomfortable and realizing you don't have a lot of the documentation, then I think there's a benefit for just about anybody, especially if you have, I mean, you'd like to have at least some security presence to help drive it. If you have no security team, it might be a little bit more difficult. But once again, it doesn't need to be cybersecurity specific. Every company has incidents, operationally or through security. So I think, anyone would be prepared. It'd be nice if you had an incident response plan. That's typically what we have people refer back to. Like, no one has it memorized. But yeah, I don't think anyone's too inexperienced to have one, assuming they're willing to learn and, they're okay having gaps and opportunities.
And on the other end, do you test out of it? Do you just move to just live red team exercises, or do you still build tabletops interweave the tabletops with those red team exercises?
I personally think it's still really good to have the muscle memory. Typically, you have turnover, and if there's someone who's no longer with the company, I bet they're not training that next person specifically for tabletops. I've also seen tabletops where the main incident commander or the CISO maybe, they're taken out of the room. So the person who normally lead it, all of a sudden they had a death in the family, and now they can't help. So you just throw someone else, the backup person, under the bus and figure out how prepared they are for it. So there's a lot of different ways you can go with it, where I'm sure there are some companies who feel like they don't need it, but I've always seen value no matter what.
So you throw in that chaos monkey.
Yeah.
You
It just made me
things
think of a
little more
question.
chaotic. Yeah, go ahead, Lee.
Have you had, I'm thinking about success stories. Have you had somebody get back, remember that tabletop we did together? I had to freaking use it and I nailed it kind of thing? Or it was harder than I thought, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I've had it happen before where been at a company where we've done incident response and tabletop exercises and then had an actual incident. We had all of our templates ready. I think another common recommendation for tabletop exercises is to have out of band communication. So whether your Teams or Slack goes down, or the threat actors in the environment and they're potentially monitoring your communication tool, having something like Signal to communicate out of band is really helpful. And in the incident, we already had those groups set up. So my boss had a Signal group set up with all the executives. I had a Signal group set up with our infrastructure and service desk teams. So yeah, I would argue we were really prepared. And we had a really good understanding of what it took from the different groups, who was on point, how do we find out who's on call. So I think things went smoother than they would have before the tabletops.
All right, good stuff. Ryan is available if you need a tabletop. Hopefully this helped people understand tabletops better and the importance of going through them and figuring out what's going to fail when that fateful day hits you, and you find yourself in a ransomware situation or BEC or whatever it might be. But Ryan, thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today.
Cool. Thanks for the opportunity. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, great conversation. We will be right back in a few moments with the weekly enterprise news. Lots of good stuff to chat about.